The woman in the gray sweatshirt was being escorted out of the bank like a criminal. "You're broke. We don't serve your kind here," the bank employee had snapped, her voice sharp and shrill, slicing through the silence like a blade. People turned, eyes stared. No one spoke. A few smirked. One man even chuckled. The humiliation stung more than the words themselves. That's when Carol Simmons realized something. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just a rude teller or a misinformed manager. This was about how people in power see the ones they think don't matter. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to cry. But she was going to remember everything, every word, every glance, every little moment they showed who they really were when they believed she had no power. And what they didn't know, Carol Simmons wasn't just some woman in a worn hoodie. Her husband owned the entire damn bank. Have you ever been looked down on just because of how you dressed? Just because someone decided you didn't belong? Where are you watching from, and have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to rise stronger than anyone expected? That morning had started like any other. Carol had poured herself a lukewarm cup of coffee and leaned against the kitchen counter, watching sunlight filter through the lace curtains. Edward was already dressed, meticulous as ever in his tailored navy suit and polished shoes that reflected the marble floor of their entryway like mirrors. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, adjusting his cufflinks. Not looking up, Carol smiled faintly. "Isn't that what you asked me the day I agreed to marry you?" "That was different. You were saying yes to being married to a banker, not infiltrating his kingdom." She shrugged, pulling her blonde hair into a ponytail and grabbing the oversized gray sweatshirt that always made her feel invisible in public. That was the point today. Invisibility. "I think it's time we saw what's really happening inside your Hartford branch," she said. "You said yourself the complaints are stacking up. Maybe it's time for a closer look. A human look." Edward hesitated. "You'll be on your own. You know that, right? That's the whole idea." They had planned it like an undercover mission, which felt almost comical considering Carol's background had nothing to do with espionage or corporate audits. She was a former middle school English teacher, not a spy. But there was something undeniably important about this idea of walking into a place that assumed it could size people up by the shoes on their feet and the car they drove. She would be anonymous. She would ask to deposit a check and inquire about a personal loan. Just that, no drama, no script, just observe, and maybe get a little taste of what so many others were experiencing when they didn't carry the right designer purse. Carol left the house in a 10-year-old sedan, not the sleek black Lexus parked in the garage. She'd chosen every element of her disguise with care, though it wasn't much of a disguise at all. This was how she used to look before Edward's career had taken off, before Fairfield County, before gala dinners and country clubs and business class flights. And truthfully, a small part of her missed it, the anonymity, the simplicity. As she pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Financial's Hartford branch, she took a deep breath. The building was imposing, all gleaming glass and stone columns, a monument to wealth and exclusivity. She could already feel the stares. Inside, the lobby was pristine, cold, clean, efficient in the way that made a person feel like a statistic. A place where being seen was transactional. "Good morning," she said to the young man at the reception desk. He looked up. His smile was professional, but it faltered as his eyes scanned her clothing. Just a flicker. But Carol caught it. "I'd like to deposit a check," she continued, "and ask about a personal loan." "Do you have an account with us?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, calmly. "What's your name?" "Carol Simmons." He began typing, then frowned. "I'm not seeing that name." Carol leaned slightly forward, keeping her voice even. "Could you try C. Simmons?" He sighed, not heavily, just enough to make her feel it. A few moments later, he nodded toward a woman standing behind a desk. "You'll need to speak to Miss Reynolds. She can assist you." Carol approached, already aware that Reynolds had clocked her appearance the moment she walked in. Her eyes swept over Carol with a practiced look of mild disdain. Carol could practically hear the woman's thoughts. "Not one of ours." "Do you have an appointment?" Reynolds asked. Crisp and clipped. "No, but I was hoping to. We usually require appointments for loan consultations, especially for significant amounts. Carol held out her check. It's just a deposit, $5,000. Reynolds took the check like it was a dead mouse. And where is this from? My personal account. At another bank. I see. The woman held the check up to the light, squinting at it like she expected invisible ink. You understand we have procedures for unusual transactions. It's not unusual. Carol replied, just a deposit. Still, we may need to place a hold, perhaps up to 15 business days. Carol's brows lifted. 15. That's excessive. It's our policy. For customers like you, customers like me, Reynolds stepped back, folding her arms. Look, Mrs. Simmons, this branch serves a very particular clientele, people with certain assets. Carol said nothing. She didn't have to. The room had grown quieter. A few customers were definitely eavesdropping now. If you don't mind, Reynolds continued, we have other clients waiting, people who, well, let's just say they don't come in wearing sneakers. Carol's voice was calm. Are you refusing my deposit? Not at all. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps a different institution might better suit your needs. And if I insist on speaking to your manager, he's busy. And if I stay right here, then I'll have to ask security to escort you out. It was like watching a play she already knew the ending to, but still felt every line land like a punch. The humiliation wasn't just about the money, it was the assumption. The way Reynolds' voice turned venomous when she said the word broke, like it was a moral failing, like being poor or looking poor was something shameful. When the guard approached, Carol saw the sympathy in his eyes. That made it worse. Outside, she stood on the sidewalk, blinking against the afternoon sun. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Edward, she said when he picked up, you're going to want to be here. Now, she met him around the corner, still holding her composure. She told him everything, every insult, every loaded glance. Edward's jaw tightened with every word. This wasn't just a mystery solved. This was rot exposed. When they returned together, the effect was immediate. Heads turned, whispers passed. The receptionist's eyes went wide. Reynolds, mid-sentence with a well-dressed couple, caught sight of Carol and then saw Edward beside her. Her expression collapsed into panic. And the thing is, Carol didn't want revenge. She didn't need Reynolds to beg. She just wanted the truth to be undeniable. You treat people differently when you think no one's watching. But what if someone always is? The scent of mahogany polish and overbrewed coffee greeted Edward Simmons as he stepped into the Hartford branch of Riverside Financial, his leather soles tapping sharply against the marble floors. The branch was designed to intimidate tall glass walls, glossy surfaces, and muted tones that whispered exclusivity. Every corner was curated, not for comfort, but for status. He stood near the entrance for just a second too long, eyes scanning the space like a general surveying a battlefield. And it was in a way, his battlefield. His wife had been humiliated here. Carol stood a few steps behind him, quiet but resolute. She wasn't wearing the gray sweatshirt anymore. She had changed into something more neutral, dark jeans, a navy blouse, unremarkable still, but clean, sharp. The sweatshirt had served its purpose as they moved forward. The young receptionist who had first directed Carol hesitated before rising from his seat. Recognition flickered across his face. But he couldn't place Edward. Not yet. The realization didn't take long. Though, when the branch manager, Gregory Phillips, saw Edward cross the floor, he practically stumbled over his own feet to greet him. Mr. Simmons, sir. We weren't expecting you until he stopped mid-sentence as his gaze landed on Carol. There was no mistaking her now. My wife, Edward said flatly. By way of introduction, Philip's mouth opened, closed, and then opened again. There must have been a misunderstanding. Carol remained silent, watching as the cracks began to appear in the carefully maintained veneer of professionalism. Edward was calm, but there was steel in his voice. I'd like to speak to the employee who assisted her. Right now, Phillips hesitated, Perhaps we could step into my office first. And no, the single syllable halted all argument. From across the room, Miss Reynolds finally looked up. She'd sensed the shift in atmosphere, the way the room had changed density. Her eyes landed on Edward, then Carol, a flicker of confusion, then comprehension, and with it, fear. Edward walked directly toward her, not bothering to wait for Phillips or pleasantries. The room quieted, the hum of quiet banking business dying down like someone had slowly turned down the volume knob. Miss Reynolds, Edward began, his voice perfectly modulated. Professional. Deadly? You remember my wife? I assume Reynolds nodded, her face pale, her composure beginning to fracture. Carol stepped slightly forward now. I came here to make a deposit. You accused me of fraud. You called me broke. You had me escorted out like a thief. I didn't know. That's exactly the problem. Edward interrupted. You didn't know, and you didn't care. The bank had fallen into silence. Employees froze at their desks. Customers stared over shoulders. Edward turned slightly, raising his voice enough to reach everyone in the room. For those of you who don't recognize me, I'm Edward Simmons, CEO of Atlantic Financial Group. We acquired Riverside Financial 3 months ago. A collective breath caught in the room. My wife visited this branch today to assess the customer service firsthand. We've received an alarming number of complaints about this location, about arrogance, bias, and discriminatory behavior. I wanted to believe they were isolated incidents. Today, I saw they're not. Miss Reynolds visibly shook now. Mr. Simmons, I've always spare me, he said, cutting her off with an almost clinical coldness. You saw a woman who didn't fit your profile of wealth and importance, and you decided she wasn't worth your time. You mocked her, belittled her, and ultimately tried to erase her from the space, all while assuming no one important was watching. He gestured at the stunned employees and customers. But someone always is. Gregory Phillips finally stepped forward again. Mr. Simmons, I assure you this is not representative. No, Edward raised an eyebrow. Then I'll be conducting interviews with your entire staff. We'll determine how deep this culture runs. But we already have one piece of clarity. This is the standard of behavior when you think no one's watching. That alone speaks volumes. He turned back to Reynolds. Effective immediately. You are suspended. Pending a full investigation, HR will follow up with next steps. Reynolds nodded, unable to speak. Edward's voice softened just a fraction as he turned to the security guard, who had hung back near the wall. James, isn't it? Yes, sir, the guard replied quietly. Thank you for treating my wife with decency today. I heard what you said to her on the steps. James looked down, embarrassed. I just tried to do the right thing. And you did. We'll talk again shortly. Edward turned and faced the room once more. For those wondering if today's spectacle was about ego or revenge, it's not. This is about accountability and transformation. He paused. We'll be rebuilding this branch, not just physically, but culturally. That starts now. Over the following weeks, the Hartford branch of Riverside Financial came in ways large and small. Gone were the sterile front counters and intimidating layout. In came open space consultation areas, privacy pods, and friendly greeters who offered help without scanning your shoes first. Carol had no formal title in the bank's operations, but she attended the team meetings anyway, quietly, observantly, listening to stories from employees who'd been silenced before tellers afraid to speak up about toxic supervisors, junior staff who had been told not to waste time with working-class clients. One of those stories came from a young woman named Raquel, a bilingual teller who'd worked weekends. I once helped a woman who didn't speak English well. Raquel said during a feedback session, she had $40,000 in savings from years of cleaning houses. She just wanted to open a joint account with her daughter, but my manager pulled me aside and told me not to waste time, said she probably got the money under the table and it might be flagged. Carol had to force herself to remain silent. That story made her hands clench, not just because of the cruelty, but because she had seen that same pattern across the country institutions that claimed to welcome all, but in practice only served the polished. Edward listened too. He took notes. The rebuild was more than cosmetic. He brought in consultants to retrain leadership, implemented anonymous employee surveys with direct reporting to the executive board, created a new code of ethics that was printed and displayed in every room, not just stored in a digital file somewhere no one ever opened. Most visibly, they installed a plaque in the Hartford branch's new reception area, simple bronze lettering, set into polished walnut. Respect is not a luxury, it's a baseline. The quote wasn't attributed, but everyone who worked there knew where it came from. A month later, Carol returned to the branch with Edward for a quiet walkthrough. No press, no fanfare, just observation. She wore the same gray sweatshirt, not to test them but to remind herself. As they walked past the new customer care lounge, Carol spotted an elderly woman being helped patiently by a new hire, a young man with bright eyes and soft manners. He didn't once glance at the woman's outdated handbag. Carol smiled. She leaned slightly against Edward and whispered, "It's working." He nodded. "It's a start." They paused at the new suggestion box, real wood, not the token plastic kind no one ever checks. Someone had left a note in a bold handwriting. "It feels human here now. Thank you." Carol folded the note gently and slid it back in. And as they exited, the new concierge at the door, James, now promoted, smiled and held the door for them. "No one leaves feeling small anymore," he said softly. Carol looked around one last time, then turned to Edward. "You know," she said, "for all the ugliness that day held, I'm glad it happened." He gave her a puzzled glance. "Because they didn't just underestimate me," she continued. "They revealed themselves, and you can't fix what you haven't seen." Edward's face softened. "You always see what matters." They walked out into the sunlight together. Carol didn't need power to be powerful. She only needed to be seen. And now so would everyone else. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at Riverside Financial's Hartford branch, but the ripple effects were only just beginning to reveal their reach. What started as a humiliation had become a reckoning not just within one bank or one town, but across a larger network of institutions that had grown far too comfortable hiding behind prestige, protocols, and polite exclusion. The story had leaked, not by Carol, not by Edward, but by someone in the room that day, perhaps a customer who'd recorded the confrontation discreetly, or an employee whose conscience had finally stirred. Either way, within a week, a shaky video clip had surfaced on social media. It showed a calm, steely man in a navy suit standing beside a woman in jeans and a quiet expression, calling out elitism in the very lobby that once prided itself on polish. It went viral. The caption read, "Bank employee mocks woman for looking poor." Then her husband, the bank's owner, walks in less than 48 hours. The clip had been shared by major news outlets. Think pieces followed. Morning talk shows debated the ethics of financial profiling. Comment sections buzzed with stories from viewers who had been judged for their shoes, their names, their accents. Carol watched it unfold from their kitchen counter, the same one she'd leaned on before stepping into the Hartford branch for the first time. But now, every time she refreshed her screen, there were new comments, new emails, messages poured in from strangers, some thanking her, others sharing heartbreakingly similar experiences. One email stood out. It was from a man named Luis Ortega, a former manager at a regional bank in New Mexico. "I was let go for speaking up about discrimination against working-class clients." He wrote, "They said I didn't understand brand positioning. Seeing your story gave me hope that maybe someone up there finally sees what we've been dealing with." Carol read it twice, then forwarded it to Edward without comment. He replied within 5 minutes, "Find him. Let's talk." Luis Ortega flew into Connecticut the following week. He was in his early 40s, with the cautious confidence of someone who had learned to measure his words carefully. In their conference room overlooking the river, he shared stories that mirrored Carol's experience far too closely. Internal emails, discouraging time-wasting interactions with low-net-worth clients, pressure to steer working-class customers toward products with higher fees, outright jokes made in executive meetings about certain zip codes. Edward listened, nodding slowly. But it was Carol who leaned forward and asked, "If you could build your own branch culture from scratch, what would it look like?" Luis didn't hesitate. "I'd start with hiring. Look for empathy first, not polish. I'd remove sales quotas for entry-level staff. I'd introduce community banking days where we invite local nonprofits and offer financial education workshops for free. No product pitches. I'd build trust first, revenue second. Edward exhaled, almost a laugh. Radical thinking. Which is to say, human thinking. Carol smiled. Let's try it. They brought Luis on as the Director of Inclusive Experience, an experimental title for an experimental idea: rebuild banking, not just as a service, but as a relationship grounded in respect. He would pilot his ideas at 3 Riverside branches, including Hartford, and have the freedom to reinvent how people were welcomed, served, and remembered. The initiative was named quietly the Carol Project. Carol protested the name. Edward overruled her. At the first team meeting under the new initiative, Carol sat at the back of the room, notebook in hand, more listener than leader. Luis stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, speaking to a room full of tellers, assistants, and regional managers who looked like they didn't know whether to feel inspired or terrified. I'm not here to make your job harder, he began. I'm here to make your job matter more. He clicked the remote. The screen behind him displayed a quote. People will forget what you said, forget what you did, but never forget how you made them feel. Maya Angelou. A few heads nodded. Luis continued. You have the power to make someone feel human in a place that often forgets to be human. And I don't care how long you've been here or how many suits walk in the door, if you look someone up and down and make them feel small, you will not be part of this bank's future. Carol watched as the mood shifted: skepticism, resistance. Then, in a few faces, cautious relief. A teller raised her hand. She looked young, barely out of college. What happens when we're caught between serving a customer well and hitting a sales goal that punishes us for taking too long with someone? Luis smiled. That's the exact question I'm here to answer with new policies. You'll get clarity soon. But first, I need your stories. The good, the bad, the ones that keep you up at night. Another hand, an older gentleman this time. Will this actually change anything? Or is this one of those initiatives that lasts until the next quarterly report? Carol stood now, her voice gentle but firm. 3 months ago, I stood in this very lobby and was told I didn't belong because of what I wore. I could have walked away. Instead, I came back with my husband and we changed leadership. Today, I'm still here, and I plan to be here until we get this right. That silence, the breath-holding kind, returned. It didn't feel like a training anymore. It felt like a shift. The Carol Project grew, slowly, deliberately. They began with a respect audit, anonymous surveys where clients were invited to share their experience, not just in stars or numbers, but in feelings. The data was eye-opening. 42% of respondents said they felt judged by staff based on appearance. 27% had hesitated to return to the bank due to an interaction that left them feeling invisible. 61% said they would recommend the branch now that changes were underway. Carol read every line. She cried over some, laughed at others. One note in particular stayed with her. A woman in scrubs came in after a night shift. She looked exhausted. A teller offered her coffee and let her sit before beginning the transaction. She said, "This is the first time I haven't felt like an inconvenience." That teller was promoted, not for boosting sales, but for restoring dignity. Then came the awards. Within 6 months, the Carol Project was featured in Forbes as a model for rehumanizing finance. By the end of the year, customer retention was up 18% at the 3 pilot branches. But Carol cared less about the metrics than the moments. Like the teenager who came in to cash his first paycheck and said, "You guys talk to me like I'm not a kid." Or the single mom who brought in her daughter and whispered, "She's never been in a bank where people smiled at us." And still, despite the headlines, Carol remained behind the scenes. No interviews, no spotlights. She wasn't looking to be a brand. She was just a woman who'd been dismissed once too often and decided that silence wasn't acceptable anymore. On a chilly afternoon in late fall, Carol returned once more to the Hartford branch, this time alone. James, now wearing a suit and a nameplate that read Client Experience Director, greeted her at the door. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, his voice warm. "Welcome back." She smiled. "You dropped the security from your title?" "I upgraded," he said, a twinkle in his eye. They both laughed. Inside, she watched as a man in work boots was greeted like an old friend. A woman in a hijab was assisted in Arabic by a bilingual associate. Two kids sat in the corner, coloring while their grandmother signed papers nearby. It didn't look like a bank. It looked like a place people belonged. She stood in the center of the lobby, taking it in. And for the first time, fully, she allowed herself to believe what started as a quiet humiliation had grown into a movement, and all it took was being underestimated. By the time spring thawed the last of Hartford's snow, the Carroll Project had become more than a pilot program. It was a full-scale blueprint. What started in 3 branches had expanded to 11. Edward's board, initially cautious and skeptical, had grown uncharacteristically quiet, not because they disagreed, but because the data had become undeniable. Respect, it turned out, wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. Carol still refused a formal title, but she wasn't hiding anymore either. Her presence had become a kind of gravity. She attended leadership meetings, not as a figurehead, but as a living reminder of how quickly power could reveal itself in the subtlest gestures, like a glance, a tone, or the length of a pause after someone says, "I don't think you belong here." But even as her influence grew, Carol never forgot the sting of that sentence. "You're broke. We don't serve your kind here." It echoed not as a wound, but as a compass. So when Edward mentioned the internal resistance brewing at one of the suburban branches Trumbull, a high-performing location with top revenue and equally high staff turnover, Carol didn't hesitate. "I'll go," she said. Edward looked up from his desk. "You're sure this one's different? The complaints aren't as overt? No Reynolds types? Just a sense of coldness. Something, off. All the more reason." Carol replied, "The poison that doesn't scream is the one that seeps deepest." She arrived at the Trumbull branch on a quiet Wednesday morning, dressed again in neutral tones, not quite the sweatshirt, but still simple. No announcement, no prearranged meeting. She entered as a customer, not an overseer. The lobby was pristine. The walls were pale blue, the lights soft, the scent of expensive citrus diffusers wafting subtly through the air. It was calm, too calm. Carol approached the concierge desk. A man in his 50s, neatly dressed, greeted her with a professional but hollow smile. "Welcome to Riverside Financial. How can I help you today?" "I'd like to open a savings account," Carol replied. He nodded, motioning toward a waiting area. "One of our representatives will be with you shortly." She sat. 10 minutes passed, then 15. A young couple walked in, visibly affluent, designer bags, luxury watch, high-end stroller. They were greeted with enthusiasm and quickly ushered into a private room. Carol waited. After 27 minutes, a woman with a tight bun and clipboard finally approached. "Name?" she asked, without looking up. "Carol Simmons." The woman blinked, then typed, "Appointment, no. I was told someone would help me." The woman sighed through her nose. "I'll see what I can do." She turned and disappeared without another word. Carol sat back and looked around. The employees were efficient, polished, perfectly mannered, and yet she could feel it, the quiet message beneath the smiles. "This place is for people like us. You must prove you're one of us before we serve you fully." She thought about leaving, not out of defeat, but to create contrast, to return again under a different name, in a sharper suit, with a Rolex on her wrist. But that wasn't the point. The point was to see what happened if you never changed anything but the lens through which they viewed you. Another 15 minutes passed before the same woman returned. "We can squeeze you in for a basic consultation. Come with me." Carol followed her to a small desk in the corner. Not a private room, not the concierge-level suite the couple had received. The woman introduced herself as Jennifer. Her tone was professional, but her words were rushed. "We offer 3 tiers of savings accounts. Based on what I see here, you'd qualify for Tier 1, Minimum balance is 500. Carol raised an eyebrow. That's the entry-level account, Jennifer nodded. Unless you have existing investment accounts over 50,000. Carol said nothing. Jennifer continued with a rehearsed script, pointing at laminated brochures, never once asking about Carol's goals, plans, or financial literacy. Just facts, bullet points, a transaction, not a conversation. At the end, Carol asked, "Do you offer any financial planning consultations?" Jennifer paused. "Not for Tier 1 accounts. We can refer you to an online tool." Carol's pen hovered over the intake form. "What about the couple who came in earlier? The ones with the stroller?" Jennifer hesitated. "They're Tier 3 clients. We offer different services at that level. And if I said I had a trust fund and needed guidance," Jennifer straightened, "well, then we'd arrange a more tailored experience." "Of course." Carol set down the pen. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think I've seen enough." That afternoon, Carol didn't go straight to Edward. She went to Luis Ortega. He was in a team meeting at the Stamford branch, discussing a new training module. When she entered the room, he paused mid-sentence and gave her a nod. Carol waited until the meeting ended, then shared her notes. Luis listened, then frowned. "We've had red flags from Trumbull for months. Low turnover because it's seen as a promotion branch, polished clients, high returns, minimal hassle. But that's just code. It's where compassion goes to die." Carol nodded. "They're not overtly cruel. They're just, disengaged, but in a way that punishes anyone who doesn't already fit the mold." Luis tapped his fingers on the table. "I think it's time for what? To pilot the empathy audits." Carol tilted her head. "We were saving those." Luis smiled. "Not anymore." The empathy audit was simple in design, radical in effect. Customers received a short survey after each visit, not just asking whether they were helped efficiently, but whether they felt seen, whether they felt listened to, whether they were made to feel like they mattered. Regardless of their appearance, age, accent, or income, each survey ended with one question: "Would you return if you weren't rich?" The responses from Trumbull were sobering. "I felt like I was interrupting a luxury showroom. I was told to use the website when I asked a question. I only got service after someone saw me counting cash." Carol read each one, her heart clenched. But also, it clarified something: elitism no longer needed to wear a sneer. It could dress in pressed shirt, polite tones, and marble floors and still leave someone feeling like a stain on the carpet. She and Luis crafted a plan. They rotated new hires into the Trumbull branch, people from diverse backgrounds, including second-chance employment programs. They scheduled cross-branch visits where high-performing staff were shadowed by employees from less privileged branches. They created storytelling circles, where employees had to share a time they had felt judged or dismissed. At first, there was resistance. Jennifer quit. So did two senior consultants who believed the changes diluted the brand, but others stayed. Some changed. One senior banker, George Lemaire, stood up during a team debrief and said, "I've worked here 22 years. I thought I was just being efficient, but I've realized I was being selective. I saw time as a privilege, not a gift. That changes now." And it did. 6 weeks later, Carol returned. She wore the same outfit. She asked to open the same account. This time, she was greeted within 4 minutes. A young man named Malik offered her water before she even sat down. He asked what her goals were. He asked what she wanted beyond the numbers. He treated her like a person. Carol left that day without saying who she was. It didn't matter. The culture had shifted because people had chosen to see. Later that month, at a company-wide town hall, Edward took the stage. He spoke briefly about profit margins, then paused. "And now," he said, "I want to invite the person who taught us the most without ever raising her voice." Carol stepped onto the stage. The applause was thunderous, but she didn't smile for attention. She smiled because she saw the change reflected back at her in the faces of people who'd learned that dignity isn't seasonal. It isn't strategic. It's a right. And it begins the moment you decide no one is small here. 3 months after the empathy audits had begun reshaping branches like Trumbull, A new challenge emerged, one Carol hadn't anticipated, and one that threatened to fracture the very progress they had so carefully built. It started with a letter, not an email, not a complaint through official channels, an actual envelope delivered to the corporate office, handwritten, addressed simply to Miss Booz Simmons. It was postmarked from a small town in Vermont, Bridgerton, population barely 3,000. Carol opened it at her kitchen table, expecting a thank you or a personal story. Instead, she found a cry for help. Dear Mrs. Simmons, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I'm writing because I saw what happened at your bank. I saw the video, and I saw the changes you helped make. I live in a town where the bank is the only financial institution within 40 miles. It used to be community-run, respectful, even warm. Then, last year, Riverside bought it. Since then, my mother was denied a loan despite perfect credit. My cousin, a mechanic, was told he couldn't open a business account until he submitted 6 months of reputation documentation. There are no options here, no alternatives. Please do. Small towns matter to people like you. It was signed Anna Carlisle, age 17, a student, a daughter, a witness. Carol folded the letter slowly. She stared out of the window for a long time. She remembered her own roots, rural Vermont, dirt roads and slow seasons. Her father was a truck driver. Her mother, a substitute teacher. She remembered standing in line with her mother at a local credit union, watching how the teller always knew everyone's name, not because of a CRM system, but because they'd gone to school together. Edward entered the kitchen moments later, briefcase in hand. One look at her face and he stopped mid-step. What is it? She handed him the letter. He read it twice. Bridgerton, he asked quietly. I didn't even realize we had a branch there. Carol nodded. You do. And it's failing the people it was supposed to uplift. He leaned against the counter. Processing. We've been focusing on high-traffic branches, the ones that make headlines. But the damage in places like this, it's quieter, harder to trace, and easier to ignore. Carol added. She stood, resolve firming in her shoulders. I want to go, not as a CEO's wife, not as a program leader, just as a woman walking into a bank that forgot who it's supposed to serve. Edward didn't argue. He just said, then let's make sure someone's listening when you do. Bridgerton was 2.5 hours north, tucked between pine forests and sleepy hills. Carol drove herself, refusing a driver. She wanted the time, the silence. She arrived on a gray morning. The bank building sat at the edge of the town square, between a hardware store and an old diner. It had once been a credit union, its brick facade modest and inviting. Now, the nameplate read Riverside Financial, but the warmth had been stripped. The windows were tinted. The sign was a glossy blue acrylic corporate, out of place. Inside, there were only 2 customers, an older man filling out a form and a young mother with a restless toddler. 2 tellers stood behind the counter. One of them glanced up as Carol entered, then returned to tapping on her keyboard. The other offered a lukewarm, "Be right with you." Carol waited, watched. The toddler dropped a tune. The mother bent down to retrieve it, accidentally dropping her papers. The teller barely glanced over. No offer to help. Carol approached the second teller when the desk opened. I'd like to speak to someone about opening a business account, she said. The teller, mid-30s, sharp chin, dark suit, nodded mechanically. What kind of business? Freelance design. Carol answered truthfully. The teller raised an eyebrow. Do you have client references? I do. 3 months of invoices, tax ID, business website. I can provide all of those. Yes. The teller's tone didn't change. We have minimum thresholds for new business accounts. You'll need to submit documentation of revenue over $10, $1,000 per quarter, or a business plan reviewed by a certified financial partner. Carol blinked. Is that standard practice? It's policy here. She nodded. Could I speak to the branch manager? A flicker of annoyance passed through the woman's eyes. He's in a meeting. I'll wait. Carol sat on a worn faux leather bench in the corner. Over the next 40 minutes, she watched more interactions. Polite, clipped, indifferent. Everyone was treated like a burden until proven valuable. When the manager finally emerged, he was younger than she expected, early 30s. Confident in a way that felt brittle, he introduced himself as Todd Renner. Carol stood. Mr. Renner, thank you for making time. I'm Carol Simmons. His face barely reacted. I'm here because I received a letter from a local teenager. She described this branch as inaccessible, cold, discriminatory, even. Renner smiled tightly. I assure you we treat all customers equally. Carol tilted her head. That's the problem. Mr. Renner, equal treatment isn't always fair. If someone walks in without a polished resume, polished jacket, do they still get patience, time, respect? He hesitated. We're following standard compliance measures, risk management, procedural integrity. That's a lot of words to say you don't trust your own community. Renner's face hardened. And may I ask what role you're here in today? Investor consultant Carol looked him dead in the eye. I'm a woman who knows what it feels like to be treated as disposable, and now I help make sure that never happens in banks with my name on them. Renner paled. Your yes. And now I'd like to meet your team. Today, all of them. Oh. The meeting was held in the break room, a cramped space with stale coffee and laminated posters on the walls. The staff gathered awkwardly. Carol stood at the front. No notes, no slides. I didn't come here to lecture you. She began. I came because someone reached out in desperation. She pulled out Anna Carlisle's letter. She's 17. She saw how her mother was treated. She saw how her cousin was made to feel like his hands weren't clean enough to hold a bank account. And she asked a question none of us should ignore. Do small towns matter to people like you? Silence, Carol continued. The answer must be yes, but not with press releases or slogans, with actions. She invited the staff to speak, slowly. A young teller named Grace shared how she used to bring cookies on Fridays, but was told to stop because it set the wrong tone. A maintenance worker mentioned he had to use a separate entrance because he looked disruptive during client hours. Carol listened, took notes, promised follow-up, and she delivered. Within 4 weeks, Riverside Bridgerton was restructured. Todd Renner was reassigned quietly but firmly. In his place came someone new, an interim manager chosen not for profit skills, but for community empathy. Grace, the cookie bringer, was promoted to lead customer experience. The tinted windows were removed, the coffee was free again, and the letter was framed and hung in the lobby, next to a new sign that read, We don't check your worth by your wallet. We start with your name. Anna Carlisle was invited to the reopening. She wore her Sunday best, spoke softly, but when Carol hugged her and whispered, You changed your town, the girl finally smiled wide. Weeks later, as Carol drove home, she thought about how change rarely arrived in applause or headlines. Sometimes it arrived in envelopes, in stories whispered across counters, in silent mothers, in tired workers, in 17-year-olds who dared to ask one brave question, do we matter? Carol now had only one mission, make sure the answer was always yes. It began with a voicemail. Carol found it one evening while folding laundry, the hum of the dryer rattling softly in the background. The voice was cautious, almost brittle with hesitation. Hi, Mrs. Simmons. My name's Marcia Ellington. I used to work for Riverside Springfield branch. I don't know if I should even be calling, but I heard about what happened in Bridgerton, and I thought maybe you should know. Some of us tried. We tried to speak up, but they made us disappear. Quietly, she left her number. No other details. Carol called her back the next morning. The woman who answered sounded older, mid-50s, maybe. Her voice was weathered, but steady. They agreed to meet at a diner halfway between Hartford and Springfield. No offices, no boardrooms, just two women sitting across a chipped linoleum table, sipping lukewarm coffee under flickering lights. Marcia came prepared. She carried a binder. It was old and worn, the tabs fraying. Inside were emails, printouts, and hand-scrawled notes. I was assistant branch manager for 8 years, Marcia said, her hands folding over the binder like it was a shield. We had a culture before the acquisition, a real one, birthday cards, potlucks. We knew our clients' kids' names. And then, after Riverside took over, the playbook changed. Carol listened. Barely touching her coffee, they brought in this consultant from corporate, Randall Dykes. Slick guy, all teeth and numbers, said we needed to reposition the branch's value optics. At first, it was little things dress code tightening, mandatory language scripts, then it turned into more. Marcia flipped open the binder and pointed at a printed email. This was the first one. Climb, she said. They started flagging certain zip codes for customer efficiency review. That was code for if they don't have high deposits or investment potential. Push them to the app. Don't engage in deep service. Carol scanned the document. It was filled with euphemisms, streamline low-yield demographics, optimize in-branch time allocation, prioritize value-aligned clients. They made kindness feel like waste, Marcia said quietly. Then came the firings. Not all at once, slowly. Strategic layoffs, redundancies. Marcia had been one of them. They said I wasn't adapting to the new model, but what they meant was I wasn't looking the other way. Carol closed the binder. Why now? Why call me after all this time? Marcia's face didn't waver. Because when I saw that you didn't just walk out of that bank, but walked back in and changed it, I thought maybe, finally, someone would listen, even to the ones they erased. Carol sat back. The implications stretched far beyond Springfield. Marcia, she said, how many other branches do you think followed this model? Dozens. Marcia answered without pause. Maybe more. That evening, Carol convened an emergency meeting at the Hartford office. Edward was there, so was Luis Ortega, along with two key ethics officers and a senior board advisor. Carol laid the binder on the table. This is a map, she said, a map of where our problem began. Springfield was a prototype. Luis flipped through the documents. Dykes? I've heard that name. He was a private contractor under the previous COO. No longer with us officially, but his fingerprints are still on some policy architecture. Edward leaned forward. If even a fraction of this is true, we're looking at a systemic design discrimination not by accident, but by algorithm. Carol nodded. And the worst part? We've been fixing what we can see front-facing behavior. But this is underneath. It's the code running the machine. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of realization settling like dust. Then Edward said, we need a full audit from the ground up. Everything, every policy, every incentive structure, every customer segmentation model, Luis added. And we don't do it quietly. We make it public. We show that we're not hiding from this. Carol's voice was low, steady. Then let's burn it all down and build something better. They called it Project Ledger, a full transparency initiative. It began with releasing a public statement. We have discovered that some legacy practices embedded in Riverside systems have failed to uphold our current standards of dignity and equality. We will confront this openly, not with denial, but with responsibility. They launched a portal ledger, Riverside Financial. It listed every ongoing audit, every branch undergoing review, and a form where employees, current or former, could submit anonymous stories. Within 72 hours, over 600 entries came in. Some were short. I was told not to waste time on clients without business attire. Others detailed policy-level manipulation. We were ranked by how many low-yield clients we could reroute to online-only support. Some were heartbreaking. My mom cried when they told her they couldn't approve her loan because her income wasn't stable enough, even though she's cleaned the same office building for 11 years. Carol read as many as she could, often late into the night. Seated at her kitchen table, laptop glowing softly against a dark room, she started writing back, not form letters, real messages. To some, she offered apologies. To others, she asked questions. To a few, she simply said, I believe you. Meanwhile, the ripple effects began to take shape. Branches under investigation underwent deep restructuring. Not just staff, but systems. Algorithms were rewritten. Performance bonuses were no longer tied to client upgrade potential, but to feedback scores on dignity and empathy. Edward took it a step further. He introduced what the board called the threshold principle. If any policy disproportionately burdens clients based on appearance, geography, or perceived class, it doesn't belong. No exceptions. Some executives resigned, some had to be removed, but something else happened. 2. For every departure, a new leader stepped forward. People like Marcia, like Grace from Trumbull, like Luis. It wasn't just a rebrand, it was a revolution. One afternoon, Carol walked into the Springfield branch unannounced. She didn't tell anyone she was coming. Inside, she saw new staff, younger faces, more diversity. The front desk had been moved to the center of the lobby, no longer a barrier, but a welcome mat. A woman in a sunflower dress was laughing softly with a teller. A man in a wheelchair was being helped without awkwardness or hesitation. There were murals on the wall, art from local high school students. Carol stepped back outside. She stood on the sidewalk, blinking in the spring light. She could still remember the first time she was told she didn't belong. She smiled, then turned her face up toward the sun. Later that evening, back in her study, she found herself drafting a new letter. This one, to Anna Carlisle, the 17-year-old from Bridgerton. Dear Anna, you asked if small towns matter to people like me. The answer is yes, but more importantly, people like you, young, brave, watching everything are the reason anything changes at all. I hope you never stop asking uncomfortable questions. I hope you keep writing letters that shake systems, because you, too, are writing the future. And I'll be reading. Carol folded the letter, sealed it, and set it aside for morning mail. Change, she'd learned, doesn't come in a roar. It comes in waves, quiet, steady, undeniable. And when enough voices refuse to be dismissed, even the oldest systems must bend. The first protest wasn't organized by any activist group. It wasn't planned, promoted, or even anticipated. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, just outside a Riverside financial branch in downtown Boston. It began with a man in a mechanic's jumpsuit, Eduardo Mejia. He had tried to withdraw $1, $200 from his savings to cover a medical procedure for his son. The teller, trained in a now obsolete version of the risk management protocol, had flagged his account for irregular behavior. His withdrawal was denied without explanation, and he was told to return with verified documentation of emergency medical intent. Eduardo walked out, but he didn't go home. He stood on the sidewalk with a handwritten cardboard sign. Money's there, still not good enough. By the end of the day, there were 17 people standing beside him. By the end of the week, there were 300. It hit the evening news. By morning, it was a headline. Carol saw it not from a boardroom or a headline notification, but from a grainy live stream on her phone. Lying in bed, still in pajamas, coffee cooling beside her, the reporter was mid-interview with Eduardo. They don't say it to your face, he said, but you can feel it. The hesitation, the delay, the second guessing, like they're waiting for proof that you're not a thief. His son, Ethan, just 8 years old, stood beside him, holding his father's hand. Carol's throat tightened. She rose, walked into Edward's office down the hall, and held out the phone wordlessly. He watched the clip, then looked at her. You're thinking of going, aren't you? He asked. I'm not thinking, she replied. I'm going. The next morning, Carol arrived at the Boston branch just before noon. She wore no makeup. Her hair was tied back. Her coat was too thin for the weather. But she didn't care. Protesters lined the sidewalk, quiet, orderly. Some held signs, others simply stood in silence. A few carried photos, family members, friends, faces meant to remind the world that behind every denied withdrawal was a life trying to hold itself together. Carol walked through them, nodding gently, stopping only when she saw Eduardo. Mr. Mejia, she said. He turned, cautious, ready to deflect more questions. My name is Carol Simmons. Recognition flickered in his eyes. I came to listen. She said, not to speak over you. He looked her over. You're the one from the video. The wife. Carol nodded. That was the beginning. This is the middle. He motioned for her to follow him to the curb, away from the cameras. I never wanted this, Eduardo said. I just wanted my money. For my kid, I believe you. He looked down. They offered me a private resolution yesterday. Said it was a technical error. Tried to give me a prepaid card. I told them I didn't want hush money. You want dignity? Yeah. Carol breathed in the cold air. And you're right to demand it. She stepped forward and turned to face the crowd, speaking not with a microphone, but with a voice that carried. My name is Carol Simmons, and 3 years ago, I was thrown out of a bank for wearing a sweatshirt. They didn't know who I was, and that was the point, because how people treat you when they think you're no one, that's their truth. Cameras turned, phones lifted. I've spent the last year trying to fix this bank from the inside, but fixing systems isn't enough if people still get hurt. That means we haven't gone deep enough. She looked at Eduardo's son. This little boy deserves a bank that treats his father like a customer, not a suspect. So does every single one of you. There were no cheers, just silence, heavy and electric. Then Eduardo placed a hand on her shoulder. You'll stay with us. Carol nodded. As long as it takes. Inside the Boston headquarters that evening, an emergency summit was called. Edward led it, flanked by Luis Ortega, now Chief of Integrity Systems, and a recently appointed Head of Public Reconciliation, Marcia Ellington. The room was tense. Executives looked cornered. PR officers sat pale and fidgeting. Edward spoke first. The time for statements is over. We've apologized before. That isn't enough, Luis added. We're not in crisis because of bad press. We're in crisis because this institution still holds bias deep in its DNA. Marcia opened a folder. We propose a national dignity initiative. She said, a 3-part plan. She handed copies around the table. Part 1, autonomous review panels. Community-appointed panels would be created to review denied loans, flagged accounts, and escalated customer service cases. No employee connected to those cases would serve on the panels. Part 2, reparative banking credits for customers who had been discriminated against. The bank would offer restorative credits, not as hush money, but as recognition of harm, alongside the credits handwritten apologies from branch leaders. Part 3, dignity ambassadors. 1 person in every branch, not part of the chain of command, trained specifically in anti-bias support. Their job to intervene, de-escalate, and report misuse of discretion in real time. A board member looked up. This is, bold. It could cost millions. Carol replied quietly, so does losing your soul. 2 months later, the first reparative credit letter was issued. It was delivered to Eduardo Mejia. It read, Dear Mr. Mejia, your dignity should never have been conditional. We failed you, not because of a policy, but because of a person trained in a system that didn't see you clearly enough. Please accept this letter, along with a direct credit of $1, $200, not as charity, but as an acknowledgement that justice means repair. Your voice reminded us who we are meant to serve. Thank you for standing when it would have been easier to sit down. Signed, Carol Simmons, Community Chair. The Dignity Initiative. Eduardo read it aloud to his son, then folded it and placed it in a plastic sleeve. Behind his workbench, beside photos, a cross, and a tiny drawing his son had made of the two of them holding hands. The Dignity Initiative spread, not perfectly, not without pushback, but steadily. Branches once seen as lost causes became test beds for hope. Credit unions invited collaboration. Community leaders began referring struggling clients back to Riverside not as a joke, but as a viable option. Carol made quiet visits, no cameras, just conversations. In Detroit, she met a grandmother who cried as she told her how she'd been asked to remove her headscarf before a photo ID was accepted. That teller had since been removed, and the woman now sat on the local dignity panel. In Texas, she met a veteran whose denied mortgage was overturned, not by a memo, but by a young banker who had learned to ask a different question. Tell me your story. In Montana, a high school student started a financial literacy club in her rural town, inspired by Anna Carlisle's letter. And through it all, Carol kept one thing in her heart. This wasn't about being right. It was about being real. One evening, Carol and Edward sat on their back porch. The air was warm. Fireflies blinked lazily in the trees. Edward poured them each a glass of wine. You never thought it would go this far, Did you? He asked. Carol swirled her glass. I never thought it would go this deep. He looked at her. Do you ever miss the quiet? Before all this, Carol laughed softly. I miss the illusion of quiet, but not the silence. Silence was never peace, it was permission. She took a sip. Now we speak. By the time the first anniversary of the Hartford incident approached, Riverside Financial no longer resembled the institution Carol Simmons had once been escorted from in silence. The plaque near the front desk was still there. Respect is not a luxury. It's a baseline, but now, it was more than decoration. It was a daily reminder for everyone who stepped through those doors. The Dignity Initiative had surpassed internal projections. Customer retention had risen 22%. Employee turnover at historically problematic branches dropped by nearly half. The words Carol Project were now spoken in finance circles not as a soft concept, but as a case study proof that ethical reform could drive real business value. But Carol wasn't interested in metrics. She was interested in something messier, more human. The gray spaces between policy and pain, between apology and healing. So when the idea of the listening tour surfaced, she didn't hesitate. It began with a question scribbled in the margin of one of Luis Ortega's reports. What if we don't ask them to come to us? What if we go to them? Carol underlined it twice, called Luis the same day. We've spent the year talking to those we can reach. She said, now we find the ones who've given up on being reached. Within weeks, a small team assembled Carol, Luis, Marcia Ellington, and two former customers, turned community advisors. They chartered a modest mobile office, part bus, part meeting room, part recording studio. Its sides were painted not with branding, but with a simple phrase, tell us what they never asked. They called it the listening bus. Its mission to visit cities and towns where Riverside had failed most profoundly, not just in service but in memory, places where entire neighborhoods had been labeled too high risk, where bank closures had wiped out access, where trust had vanished so long ago, people didn't bother filing complaints anymore. The first stop was Camden, New Jersey. The branch there had closed 2 years before, citing unsustainable operations. It had left a community of nearly 74,000 people with only one remaining full-service bank. Carol stepped off the bus that morning into a warm breeze and wary stares. Flyers had been posted for days. We're not selling, we're listening. It took nearly an hour before someone approached the folding table set outside the community center. She was in her 70s, wore a blue church dress and white orthopedic shoes. Her name was Miss Rosa. I don't need a loan, she said, eyeing Carol carefully. Don't need charity either. You won't be offered either. Carol replied, standing. Only space. Miss Rosa sat. I had an account for 38 years. She began, and when they shut that branch, they gave me a week's notice. Said I could transfer online or drive across town. I don't drive, and I don't trust screens. Carol nodded. So what did you do? Miss Rosa smiled grimly. I hid my money in pickle jars again. Luis, listening nearby, blinked. You're serious? Miss Rosa nodded. My granddaughter's helping me open a credit union account now, but it still doesn't feel safe. Not like it did when I used to walk down the block and see Darnell at the counter. He knew my name, asked how my sister was doing. Carol's voice was quiet. Darnell's gone moved, said they cut his hours to nothing, told him customer volume didn't justify the staff. She paused. But it wasn't volume, it was value. They didn't think we were worth it. Miss Rosa signed a release form, allowing her story to be recorded. Her words would later become the opening voiceover of a short documentary produced by the Carol Project. But that day, she wasn't a symbol. She was a woman with a wound. That evening, Carol sat on the steps of the bus, staring at the city lights. They're not angry anymore. She said to Luis, they're numb. That's worse. Luis sat beside her. You still want to keep going? She looked at him. You ever try to stop a story once someone finally starts telling it? The tour continued. Pittsburgh, Tulsa, Jackson, Bakersfield, at every stop. They opened the bus doors, unfolded chairs, and laid out fresh pens and paper. A former steel worker recounted being denied a home loan because of lack of generational wealth. A refugee from Syria said he'd been offered a predatory loan at 24% APR with a smile and a handshake. A college student described how a teller assumed her account belonged to her boyfriend. They gathered these stories like pieces of glass, sharp, colorful, painful to touch, and slowly, they built a mosaic. Back at headquarters, Edward reviewed the tour footage weekly. Sometimes he watched alone. Other times, he invited senior managers. But no one left those sessions the same. In one clip, a woman simply said, "You want to know what broke me? It wasn't the rejection. It was how fast they did it. Like I didn't even matter enough to consider." Edward paused the video, stared at the frozen image. He whispered, "We have to do more." By month 5, the listening bus had logged over 4,000 miles, 650 individual stories, and partnerships with 11 local nonprofits. Carol had written hundreds of handwritten notes, not just thank you cards, but follow-ups, resources, check-ins. One of them went to a young man named Jordan Hines in Detroit. He'd told his story in barely 10 words. "They asked me for a co-signer. I was 10. Carol wrote back, "Jordan, you deserve to be a kid that day, not a threat. Thank you for trusting us with your story. We carry it forward with action, not just memory." He framed the letter, sent her a photo. The final stop of the first leg of the listening tour was back where it all began. Hartford. This time, the branch welcomed the bus with a banner that simply read, "We are still learning." Carol stood outside the revolving doors, watching customers walk in and out. James Wilson, now Director of Community Impact, joined her. "Feels strange," he said. "To come full circle." She nodded. "Stranger to realize we're not closing a loop, just widening it." That day, they held an open session in the branch's lobby. No formality, just chairs in a circle, staff, customers, local leaders. A microphone passed hand to hand. One woman, middle-aged, soft-spoken, said, "I used to walk by here every day and tell myself, not for me. Now I come in to deposit $20 and they ask me how I'm doing." James smiled. "And how are you doing?" She grinned. Seen. That night, Carol and Edward sat on the porch again. Same wine, same view. Fireflies returned, just like last year. "Do you think they'll remember this 10 years from now?" Edward asked. Carol shrugged. "Some will, some won't." She looked up at the sky. "But someone's daughter will walk into a bank one day, and they won't flinch when they see her hoodie. Someone's grandfather will get a loan without having to beg. Someone's accent won't be a barrier. Someone's skin won't be an obstacle. Someone's dignity won't be optional. And they won't know it was us. They'll just know it's normal." Edward raised his glass. "To normal." Carol clinked hers. "No." She said, "To what comes after that?"